Welcome back to Finding the Edge podcast. I'm Kyle Dupick here with Garrett Boyum.
And today we wanted to continue with part 2 of looking at the book, Dynamics of Skill Acquisition. And we're continuing to try to explore what is kind of the overall through line of like what are the authors trying to say. And then also we're trying to break down this complex text that for a lot of us, we felt like we're just jumping into the deep end. And there's like a lot of high academic language. And so we just want to try to kind of work through and help people kind of understand like, okay, what are the authors trying to do? What are they trying to communicate? And try to help people kind of navigate and kind of wayfind through this first chapter. Because I think the first chapter is really, honestly, like with all things, like where do you start? And so today, I'd like to start with Kyle. What do you think, what do you feel like is the kind of continue with the theme of last episode? Like, what do you feel like, where are they trying to take it? Because I know you've mentioned to me, like now you're into chapters 2 and 3. It's kind of, maybe it's making more sense to you. Like, what are you starting to notice about like, what is chapter 1? What are they trying to get us to understand? And where are they trying to take us?
Let's begin. Analyzing. Finding the edge.
It started with athletes and sports teams considered as complex adaptive systems. So a big old word salad there. But in chapter 2, they're going to get to more dynamical systems theory, one side of the equation, so to speak, of ecological dynamics. In chapter 3, they're going to talk about ecological psychology. So it seems like this initial foray into it, complex adaptive systems, systems thinking we talked about last time, self-organization, some of these more, I don't want to call them ethereal, but, very big things that we tried to break down a little bit. And the one thing that I've appreciated with this is us trying to identify what the author's trying to get across, not necessarily because it's the whole truth and nothing but the truth, or we can't disagree with it, but as a starting point to go, okay, what are they trying to communicate? Why did they think this was good? Is there any way that that both helps us or potentially some way we would improve it? And one of the things that I felt like we didn't touch on last time was this idea of adaptability. Complex adaptive systems, they talked about co-adaptation, but they never really pinned down adaptability. So I'd be interested with your experience studying, thinking, working through, how do you view just that idea of adaptability and why it's important from an ecological dynamics perspective, particularly when we're thinking about trying to help our athletes become more adaptable? Why is that important? How would you define it?
And to kind of start out with, to reference last episode, I talked about how a lot of words have different meanings in different contexts. And then each person kind of has their own understanding of what that word means to them. And this is where going to the chapter is helpful explaining how they understand when they use the word adaptation. They use it to mean that there's a continuous reorganization of system degrees of freedom to satisfy the ecological constraints of competition. So what I want to emphasize from what they're saying is the continuous nature of this. And as they kind of go through this, they kind of re-hit on when they're starting to talk about co-adaptation, they're talking about a continuous reorganization of modes of being or modes of performing or organizing, how the athletes are organizing their movement and their movement behaviors. And that for me was different than what I had thought. And the image that I had in my head or my definition, because for me, coming from a strength and conditioning background, when I hear the word adaptation, that is developing a certain quality. And that quality, although dynamic, meaning it can change or it changes over time, and depending upon what inputs are going in or not going in, to me, the word adaptation, if I'm going to combine it with my understanding of ecological dynamics, feels more like attractor states. So for example, if I'm working on just again, to use a strength and conditioning example, if I'm trying to improve somebody's like muscle size, hypertrophy, right? If I'm going for hypertrophy, that is as I input a certain stimulus, that's the adaptation I'm going for. Well, it's not this constantly changing thing, although it can change, but it's not like it's relatively stable over a given period of time. And so similarly, when I think about skill adaptation, it's not about something that is acquired permanently, but rather it is a state that emerges and has stability, and then over time may change because like things they have the times where they're around and then the times that they decay. So there's different time scales for like where these things are present, how they're present. Whereas in this chapter, they're really laying out like when they talk about adaptation, they're talking about something that is constantly in flux. That is really, to me, the word is more dynamic. To me, when I hear the word dynamic, I think constant flux and constant change, or something that is again like changing. So for me, that's where, going back to what you were talking about earlier, of where like for me this was a hard concept to adjust per se, and I still actually like my definition of it. But to understand what the technical,
you should scroll to 2 pages, from where you're at to I think it'd be page 5 there.
Yep.
Kind of in the middle there, they're talking about a metastable region exists between the edge of chaos, wherein it is open to random changes, and order, when it is highly structured. And when a system finds itself in a metastable region, it is most open to co-adaptation. And they have in parentheses there, changing in relation to the environment, which is a little bit of what you're saying. But I think that's kind of the point of why we wanted to bring it out, is because it feels like, again, not knowing exactly where they're going, why they're doing it, but it just felt like the way we've engaged with the idea of adaptation and athletes continuously interacting with the environment and learning to adapt to different contexts and different things that emerge, and how those things can emerge in a case. Like, man, I thought I had this. Like yesterday I was able to execute that pitch, or I was able to hit that pitch, and now I can't. What the heck's happening? And so I agree with your definition, but the funny thing is they sort of hint at it here, but you're also right that they're talking about it kind of different in other places within this chapter. And I think that's why it's such an important concept to at least bring to life a little bit, because that has totally changed. Like that idea of adaptability that you just explained has completely changed the paradigm with which I coach.
But I also feel like and this is maybe a good discussion piece here. My question is there a difference between adaptation, adaptability, and adjustability? That was kind of the thing as I was reading through this. That was the question that came up for me, is like, I feel like they're different things. Adaptability is different than, because it's the ability to adapt, right? If I'm using that word, versus adaptation is like almost a past tense word. And so like for me, that's where I'm more like, okay, we're talking about something past tense, like hypertrophy. I've achieved a certain level of hypertrophy. That's now a past tense thing, because that's something that is now a quality, versus something that is constantly changing. That is more of a state. So a state, it to me is different than like a action capability, because even too, yes, I understand like action capabilities are dynamic and they can change. But where I'm getting at is like, that seems to be like a more stable thing. And so and also past tense. Whereas like if we're talking about adaptability, that talks about the ability to change, versus like, hey, this is the change that I have made, or that has happened to the system. So like that's where, again, because if we're starting to talk about skill acquisition, going back to that, that's why I did like the change of the frame of what exactly, going back and referencing the journal article I mentioned last time, it changed the frame of like, instead of this as being something that's completely acquired and like you always have it, it's more like this is something that I have achieved, but it's not static. It's dynamic. It does change, but like it changes at different timescales. It's not like it's only instantaneous and then all of a sudden it's gone, or there for a short window. So like that's why, again, like going back to S&C principles, we understand that there's training residuals. Okay, so if you train and improve your strength, you can hold on to your strength gains for about 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. Aerobic gains, you can hold on to them for about a month. And then when you get into like speed, it's anywhere from 1 to 7 days. So you can start to see like everything has like a different time scale in which it has, you could say, a level of stability. And so that's where like I think this chapter does talk about it, but I don't want to get too off track here. It does talk about timescales as being an important factor of how we analyze things. But to bring it back to this discussion of adaptation and adaptability, I kind of really want to go back to like asking that question, like, what do you think? I feel like these words are kind of being thrown around as synonymous and like not being, at least to me, like the definitions seem to allow for you to go, okay, adaptation is the same thing as adaptability because we're talking about a continuous change that is occurring in the performer environment relationship, in the continuous reorganization of how the interacting component parts are organized.
Yeah, I've struggled with that because I feel like I just sent a video to several people. It was, like probably, I would say it was probably like my aha moment, the two skill acquisition theories, where Rob Gray, it's a fantastic. It's about 40 some minutes on YouTube where he goes through kind of the underlying theoretical principles between information processing and ecological dynamics. And I remember the first time I watched it, I had been watching his videos and listening to his podcast and agreeing with everything that he said. And then I went, and I don't know how long it was, maybe 3, 6, 9 months, something like that. But it was early enough where it was like, all this actually, not that, it makes sense, but like I agreed with it. I'm like, no, this is a way better way to coach. But then when I watched that video, it like hit me across the head. It's like, oh my gosh, no, like actually what I believe is information processing. That's how I coach. All the things that he was listing. And one of those, to answer your question, was he was comparing adjustability to adaptability. And so in some ways, like adjustability has almost became a dirty word for me because that's where I initially engaged, the differences that like he was identifying how in a information processing framework where you're looking for that one ideal movement, once you have that ideal movement, now you need to adjust your swing to a different pitch instead of learning to adapt it. He often used the idea of like, golf, adjusting your swing to a downward slope or to have to hook the ball or draw it or hit it straight instead of learning to adapt to the environment and the affordances therein. But I'll also admit, as I practically get into the world and interact with people, it's part of our lingo. Hey man, make an adjustment. And like, I don't disagree with that, and yet, like I'm not going to all of a sudden go, no, guys, we need to say, let's make an adaptation, and so.
Or two, like to go off of what we were just talking about, like, are you going to say to an athlete, I need you to reorganize how you're doing this? You know what I'm saying? Like that almost implies like, I need to throw out and like come up with something new and novel. And I think that's where I'm like, to me, this is where it feels almost too academic. Like I understand what they're doing, but like from a practical standpoint, I don't think there's anything like I'm not, I'd like to hear somebody who's a little bit more hardline, but like I don't think I am sacrificing any of because people can look this up. There's a journal article called like the 10 Commandments of ecological, psychology or dynamics or whatever. And I don't think I'm violating any of those things by not holding to the strict definition of like continuously reorganizing degrees of freedom, because I take that as like, well, no, duh, that's a given. That's going back to like, what is self-organization? That to me is what self-organization is, the constant or the continuous reorganization of degrees of freedom and how they're organized to interact with the environment. To me, that's what it is. To me, adaptation is something different. And so I still like, because I'm still preserving when I'm thinking about and interacting with my players, I'm still thinking about the performer environment relationship, or how we're going to get into this here, I think, at some point, about the landscape of affordances. Because I think that's the other thing of like how I'm thinking about this is, regardless of what I'm doing, I'm keeping in mind the performer environment relationship and then how they're they're interacting with their motor landscape and how that motor landscape is interacting with the landscape of affordances, meaning their ability to perceive different ways of acting or being within the environment. So to me, as long as I am maintaining those things, I think I don't have to be so dogmatic about the definition that has been given here, because I don't think that's what the essence of what ecological dynamics is anyways. So I think that's where, to now bring the listeners along here, for me, this is where I think it's important for other people to really not get caught up in the weeds of all these terms, but we're trying to do with this chapter here is we're trying to figure out what's the essence, what's the underlying essence and principles, what's the through line. Not so much like what are the methods, because to me a definition becomes a little bit of a method. It can be a principle, but here I don't think this isn't the underlying principle of trying to now pull it back. The underlying principle or thread or through line here, I think is more about like, okay, to break it down a little bit, it was like to understand the organism here, but then to see how the organism actually is interacting and being influenced, and how there is a mutual, reciprocal, dynamic relationship between the performer and the environment. But you have to start with the understanding that the organism is a complex, dynamic system, or adaptive system, right? Like that it has the ability to change.
And don't you think I do feel like it makes more sense personally to me, and I think we'll get to the performer environment relationship, to affordances, representative learning design. It makes more sense to me to talk about adaptability and what I'm trying to help my athletes become in that sense, and then go to that's why the performer environment relationship. And yet how they're talking about it, I do also understand, they're talking about co-adaptation, that the organism and the environment are constantly adapting to one another and changing as each one interacts. I don't know that we're getting to a different spot, but I do know you and I have similar backgrounds with the folks at Emergence, and that has always been a really big piece when we're working with athletes, is how do we make them adaptable problem solvers, not one-trick ponies who are really good at one thing and we just double down on it. And so I get why they go to co-adaptation.
Well, I think that's kind of the next place to kind of loop in here, because I think in this next title, co-adaptation as a coaching strategy to exploit learners' degeneracy. Degeneracy is another term that I think is really difficult for people.
For sure.
But before we get to go ahead.
Gray's degeneracy.
Yeah, probably.
I don't know if illustration or explanation.
Yeah, but I don't remember it offhand. You refresh me.
I'll maybe butcher it. So apologies, Rob. But he talks about like a degenerate. When you hear of the idea of a degenerate, you're like, how does that? That doesn't make any sense, right? But he's like, a degenerate is somebody who kind of like does things weird. They're a little bit off kilter, and he connects that, and I appreciate it. He connects that to like degeneracy is this idea of having multiple solutions in a very simplistic way. And so the degenerate's not one that just does something that's exactly the same. They're doing something like, oh, wow, that's a little unique. Why are they doing it that way? And so I at least appreciated him trying, because it is such a hard word. It feels like we need that visual picture of something. And so that kind of helped me initially when I heard that really confusing word of degeneracy.
I mean, to me,
is it Chow who says something degeneracy? What is it? How system elements, which are structurally different, perform the same function or yield a similar output. I'm like, okay, I don't know what that means, but yeah.
I think there's a better word for this, but to me, it's along the lines of like a problem solver. Like because what degeneracy to me, and I guess this is maybe where it kind of fits, is like the system is running into roadblocks, and so it is finding ways around those roadblocks.
Yeah. And
through the fact that it has multiple degrees of freedom. So like the system is really robust in the fact that it has all these different degrees of freedom. In some ways, I guess maybe it's troubleshooting. Like the system has so many resources. There's the word I'm looking for, redundancy, right? Like just like an airplane, right, that you get on to go fly, you want it to have a lot of redundant systems so that in an event that something causes some sort of an issue or a failure or whatever, then it can still perform and do what it needs to do. And so to me, degeneracy is basically another term for like system redundancy that allows for maximal resiliency and flexibility and adaptability.
That's great. And I remember ages ago talking to, I think it was just like a movement meetup of some kind, and the question of athlete superpowers came up and what to do with those, because they are really good at something and we don't want to take away. But the funny thing is the more I've dug into the eco-D sphere, but then also just practically tried to apply it, the guys who get stuck are the guys who go all in on the superpower and they are not adaptable. And then that superpower doesn't work. And so a lot of people inadvertently think that this idea of redundancy or degeneracy or having multiple options, multiple resources to draw from. I loved your idea there of a roadblock and finding a solution. A lot of people think, oh, so you want us to do the superpower less? And I'm like, honestly, I just actually kind of want you to do it more. But I think you have to be able to do other things in order to get back to it, right? Especially as I think about pitching, or if I face hitters, like the easiest hitter to get out when I'm scouting a guy is the guy who has one solution. I go, oh, okay. Like I remember last year we faced a young man who we saw he struggled with spin. He had like double-digit home runs on the year, was a big power swinger. And so we started to spin him early and often. And I think we threw him something like 23 out of 24 breaking balls. And it was like the fourth at bat. And he had seen like 18 consecutive and it was 0-2. And I'm like, we should probably just throw another our fastball. Like he's got to be like, we've shown like 18 consecutive breaking balls. And he is right on time. Like he just refused to change his approach. So we went back to the breaking ball and we struck him out 4 times that game. And it's like, those are the easiest guys who just have one solution instead of this idea of degeneracy, redundancy, like you're talking about.
Yeah. And I mean, the way that I like to think about it is, I'm sure I've said this multiple times on this podcast, is I think about it more in terms of like boxing or MMA, right? I keep coming back to this example of Ronda Rousey, where she was like an elite grappler, best in the world at judo and like getting submissions. But she got it in her head that she wanted to be the best boxer. And it's like, well, you're super far behind in terms of years of experience, training, etc. But you're elite at this thing. And really it's all about like, because to me, it's like you need to maintain your strength, but just use boxing as a way to get you to your strength. And similarly, to me, it's like when it comes to like pitchers or even hitters, it's like I need to have a thing that gets them off of if they adapt to my strength, I have a way to get them off of it. Because like, right, it's the same thing, right? To me as a hitter, you're trying to do what pitchers are doing, just in reverse to them of like trying to get their timing off. Like the pitcher's trying to disrupt your timing or get you off balance. I think as a hitter, if you start and have adaptability in your swing, like maybe you don't get like a home run or whatever, but if you can start putting the ball in different spots, yeah, maybe another team is like, yeah, take your single. Like, I don't care. But then it becomes a problem if the rest of your lineup is like that. Okay, like then we'll cut you to death. And then when you make a mistake, we'll really make you pay. And then all of a sudden it becomes just really an absolute slog. And so to me, that's where I try to help my hitters understand I'm trying to help you learn how to play in a way, like to use a different analogy, play tennis. Like understand it's not all about just smashing the ball as hard as possible across the net. Like it's about where you place it. It's about how you hit it. Not all spin is always not all spin is what's the word I'm looking for? Spin, we're not trying to demonize any type of spin, if that makes sense. Spin is useful in different situations. Like everybody thinks that like top spin is bad. Most hitters until Mark Spencer, I believe it's the bat doctor on Twitter, started posting about like, hey, top spin is actually really advantageous as a hitter. And maybe not for like home runs or whatever, but he was explaining like in relationship to you hit the piss out of the ball at like a 15 or 16 degree launch angle, and it literally will go right to your outfielder. So if you don't want that to happen, you probably want to put some topspin on it so that it actually gets down after you clear that infielder. And then here's where it also gets interesting, right? Like we know, generally speaking, that the majority of oftentimes when outfielders are playing standard, the majority of doubles are going to come down the line. Okay, so if I hit a fly ball up down the line, you know, and it has too much of a flight time, well, they're going to go track it down and make that be an out. But if I hit the ball hard, okay, and I put some topspin on it, and I get it over the third baseman or just the 6-hole, whatever, and it gets down quick, that thing's going to roll to the corner, and we got a double, depending upon, if you got a weird right field or whatever, some stuff, and like you can turn that into a triple or whatever. So where I'm going with this is that we need to understand that going back to like degeneracy, how many different ways when it comes to this idea and this notion for whichever side of the ball you're on, I'm just going to keep talking about hitting. But like, if I'm trying to hit it where they're not, okay, and I'm trying to exploit different things that have to do with the defense, if I can understand how to hit the ball in different ways, then all of a sudden now I'm no longer one dimensional. And I just met a new a transfer today, and like he's going to be a guy that's he's going to live on the pull side, but he needs to be able to defend, or once they shift him, to be able to get them to think twice about like doing a really hard shift. And so like, or that he can take advantage of like, okay, they're starting to shift me a little bit. Like, okay, can I adjust my pull swing a little bit to start taking advantage where they've opened up other gaps? So to me, that's where the whole goal of like degeneracy, how many different ways can you pull the ball and get hits as the defense, if we're just going to stick with that one as an example, being his strength, how many different ways can he do that? But I also think like, man, if you can improve your ability just enough to like hit the ball backside firm enough, even if it's on the ground, like put it through a 6-hole or whatever, like all of a sudden it makes the defense like start to think a little bit more of like,
For sure.
I can't just like move my third baseman way over and like open up that line, because like him smashing it down that line and like showing he can do that a couple of times, well, he's still standing on second base.
Yep.
So I think that's where like kind of like the practical application of how this applies to baseball.
It reminds me, Ian Renshaw has talked about how he feels like a lot of coaching is like deficits detectors instead of like strengths finders. And he criticizes that in the sense that like we're often like, for various reasons, some practical in terms of how you're training the guy, others like more connection wise, emotional, motivational, etc. But the thing that I appreciate that to loop it in here is when you just focus on, somebody's deficits and the things that your Ronda Rousey example there, you are going to make them weaker. So we're not saying go all in on something you're bad at. But I appreciate Ian Renshaw has said, like, really, it's just about, are your deficits going to sink you? If they're going to sink you, just get them to the place that they can float so that they don't sink you, so that you can then get to your strengths. It's very similar to what you're saying. I just finished scouting a really good team in our league, and one of the guys he'll compete for the league MVP. He's just an elite hitter, and I'm watching all of his film, and I'm going, gosh, how do you get this guy out? Because like he has these couple pitches and these couple zones that he just does immense damage, like really, really dangerous damage. So it's like, okay, stay away from those. So then I start looking at pitches and locations and sequences and just trying to figure out like, okay, where else could we go? It's like, well, basically nowhere where he won't like keep following it off until you make a mistake, and then he gets to where like he's so good at flipping it the other way or fighting a high fastball. You can kind of get in on his hands a little bit, but if you leave it low and away as a lefty, he's going to drop the barrel and he's going to hit a extra base hit. And it's like, those guys are so hard. So the point there is like, he has this immense strength with his game that he can rely on to be an elite hitter, but his deficits aren't so bad that it's like, yeah, but he can't hit a fastball up, so I'm just gonna go there all day. And no, like he can also flare that thing off for a single. You're like, geez, okay, so now I have to decide, I really need to get him out. What do I go to? And then the guy makes one mistake with a breaking ball and hangs it, and there's your double, triple home run. And so I think that's the practical, another good practical application of what I've been seeing, even as I'm doing the scouting of that idea of degeneracy, and even back to the sort of the adaptability, exploiting that learner's degeneracy there.
Yeah, absolutely. To kind of try to move things along, I feel like we could sit in that
Yeah.
for quite a while.
It feels like that performer, that's the through line that they're trying to build here, right? Is however they're talking about co-adaptation, adaptability, what we're seeing, it all is embedded in the performer environment relationship, right? And that's another, if you've been around EcoD for any amount of time, you're going to hear that. You're going to hear mutual reciprocal relationship. You're going to hear performer environment relationship. You're going to hear, hey, you can't divorce these two things. That's another key piece that gets brought up here as they're trying to build sort of their argument on their way to chapters 2 and 3 of, what they're trying to identify is so important. And that is keeping the performer environment relationship and that mutual reciprocalness between them constantly. That circular causality is maybe another thing that you would hear.
Mm-hmm. And just to kind of go back to what we were talking about before with co-adaptation, the point of how our action influences the environment and the environment influences our action. And so I think that's kind of an important piece to understand. And now, like at that level, when we start talking about like what they mean, it does make sense going back to like why they defined adaptation as this continuous reorganization of system degrees of freedom. Because now when we start talking about the co-adaptation, that's kind of going on. But like the way that I like to think about it, like analogy in my head, is like working together with somebody. Like we're constantly working back and forth and we're influencing one another towards a common goal or a common end. And it's shaping how we're seeing and thinking and behaving and interacting. And so that I think is really what this idea is trying to describe here. And so
and it lives and breathes everywhere, right? Like it's not just in our coaching. It's what you and I are trying to do right here. We're trying to, how I speak influences you, and that influences what you're saying, which, and we're trying to build, like it's everywhere. It's in the relationships we have socially. It's in how we coach our athletes. It's how we talk to people. All of these things are interacting and changing and adapting each other. It starts to open up your world and you start to see, oh man, this is such a rich theoretical grounding that's everywhere. And it actually does. That's one thing that I kept hearing over and over that I think is important to acknowledge here too, is just when you start seeing it everywhere, this framework that we're talking about, that's when it really starts to come alive for you, because you start to recognize that this isn't just like, oh, this lives over in the corner in my athletic sphere with my coaching. It's like, no, it's everywhere and in everything. And actually it's one of the ways that you can start to become a better coach, is you start to see it in different places.
And I also think for me, what's nice about having, and this whole chapter actually right at the beginning starts talking about like the benefits or the necessity of having this, like having a framework. So for example, it says here, coaches should have like clear theoretical principles for performance and learning. Why? So that they're not left to subjective opinions, traditional ways of doing things, meaning just how this is just what we've always done.
Yep.
Not, you can have good tradition. I'm not anti-tradition per se, but like I'm just doing things because that's the way we've always done it. And then, and coaching manuals that need updating regularly. And so that's kind of, to me, like that second piece of like, oh yeah, I have to like constantly rework everything. Oh, I learned this new thing. I got to chuck out everything. Yes. And like, to me, that's what, like, once I did find ecological dynamics, I was like, honestly, I don't like all that pressure. I used to feel like I had to keep up with the Joneses with regards to like, oh, what's the latest cutting edge this? Like, I don't feel like I need that. Like, yes, I will go and look at it, but now I have a way to process actually that information and then figure out how to integrate it back in.
Do you remember, maybe this is just me, but I've heard this story from a lot of different coaches, like your first coaches convention and you are just furiously writing things down. But as you start to understand, and particularly this framework, I feel like the transition for me was like I wrote everything down as a young coach because I'm just doing all the ideas that I see all these other coaches that I really respect do. And then I only wrote the things down from the people like, I started to get into with these spaces and it was like, oh, I like these things. And so that
I
doesn't
like
really
these
look like
guys
it.
or these coaches.
Exactly.
Yep.
And so they do something that kind of looks like it. So I'll write it down. Now, thanks to this framework, I listen to stuff and I go, ooh, that makes me think of another idea for a different, it's almost like what they're saying. I see it through the lens of the ecological framework. And I go, ooh, that makes me think of this that I could try in my own environment. And it's not something they said. It was just a connection and a principle that maybe they inadvertently brought out. And that's been kind of a cool transition for me to see. I'm really glad you brought that up because that's really important. The theoretical underpinnings. Do you have to have them written out? I don't know. But as you begin to explore this framework, I think you'll start to understand like what you can. I think you said it last time. It was so rich. Like, it really does allow you to go, hey, what can I kind of let go of a little bit? And what can I spend more time on that's useful for me? Because we all have limited time constraints. And so that's a really important piece to have this theoretical foundation as well.
Well, and then going back to what you were saying about like, being a young coach at ABCA, your first big coaches convention, is it for me, what it helped me realize, especially as you get more experienced and to having this theoretical framework, you can look at somebody and they have a great program and they have success. And then they're doing all these old school, or they have old school stuff mixed in there. Let's just use like towel drills or whatever, it is that you think is like, or swinging straight down to the ball, whatever it is, right? And you're like, but they have like, they lead the nation in X, or they've won a college World Series or whatever. Well, but when you really start to listen to them, you start to see, especially from an ecological perspective, you can start to pick out the other things that they don't say, because they might not even recognize, like some of these coaches who are really, really good.
Such a good point.
They don't recognize that they're doing things ecologically, and they don't even recognize that this is why they're successful. Or maybe it was the topic that they were given to give a presentation on, whatever it is.
Yep.
But when you start listening to them, you can start to actually pick out like what actually was the real reason that they are successful. Because honestly, this has for me been helpful. Like on the strength and conditioning side, it was like, okay, if I go to somebody's facility and they produce athletes that are successful and healthy, and like metrically are doing really well, even if I disagree with it, I better start asking the question, what the heck are they doing that is driving the success? Because they have to be doing something that's, I'll give an example. I'm really big on weighted balls. A facility that I was at was really anti-weighted balls, and they think they have the best velocity program or whatever, and they don't do any weighted balls. All they do is long toss and pull downs. And I had to sit there and go, they're clearly like the numbers on the velo, like the radar gun doesn't lie. Their numbers are going up. So then I have to ask myself the question, like, how is this working? And it's like, oh, well, duh. If I think about like, what are the basic principles of strength and conditioning to drive an adaptation? Volume, intensity, and load. They're holding load constant and they're modulating volume and intensity. And through that, you can drive an increase in, the metric that you're looking for, being velocity. So it was like, okay, so if you understand things from a principled standpoint, you can start to pull out like what the real reason a person's success is versus what they tell you it is. Because sometimes they incorrectly understand why they have success. They just found a thing that actually works. They don't know why. But so this framework helps with that. The last point that I want to make, and this is the whole reason I went here, is that for me, this framework becomes a way of culture. For me, like it becomes, if you think about it, like culture is like that environment that like helps push you towards where you want to go and fosters all the behavior that you want. Similarly to me, like the language, the way of thinking, the framework is in a way its own culture that helps us and guides us. And for me, it gives me in a way like kind of a confidence or like a security blanket to know like, okay, if I stay within this realm, like I'm going to be able to I'm pretty confident I'm going to be able to figure out how to help my athletes get better, regardless of the situation. Going back to like we were talking about, like when your whole thing is built around adaptability, and it's not just a word, but it's got a whole like system and framework behind it, and tons of people thinking about it. Like all of a sudden, you're just like, okay, I really have something solid to work with here. So that's why I wanted to bring up another reason why I'm a big fan of ecological dynamics.
So back to that section performer environment relationship, because they're talking about the co-adaptation. They're acknowledging how, you know, the performer and the environment are interacting with one another, mutual, reciprocal, using a little bit different language, but saying very similar things. And that gets them to affordances. Is there anything more you think is important to identify with that performer environment relationship that they're talking about, that maybe you would have liked to see them expand, or like jumping to how do they connect that performer environment relationship to affordances? Either of those feel more important to you currently?
I guess to kind of play off of what you're saying, right? The next heading after we're talking about like co-adaptation is learning design. And then they start to really kind of here in this ecological, now they say learning design and ecological dynamics. Now I really do feel like here they bring in the ecological side.
Yep.
The dynamic systems theory side is more about complex, like a complex adaptive system. The ecological psychology side is really what it brings to the table is the performer environment relationship. It's really, really focused on that. And so actually, to me, in some ways, I think in a way, like dynamic systems theory provides like it kind of grounds you in something that's a little bit more mathematical. And then when we get into ecological psychology, it's a little bit more philosophical, you could say, like, but it's still grounded in like, cause we were talking about last time, Turvey's book on,
Lectures on perception.
Yes. And how he was really trying to ground ecological psychology in like hard scientific physical sciences, grounding it in so for example, of like laws, grounding it in these different types of physical laws, like, the law of gravity, et cetera. So anyways,
I think that you need to continue on the performer environment relationship, but I do want to underscore what you said last time and that what you elucidated there again, which is these things aren't grounded in just theoretical, we're not really sure, we just kind of think. And I've actually heard that thrown at ecological dynamics. It's been thrown at me when I've gone back and forth with some folks, a lot of the folks on like, no, if you just individualize their mechanics, you test them, you do this and that. And we're grounded in the science, right? We're grounded in exactly what the science says. You're not. You're just a theory and you hope it works. And it's like, okay, I know that we're piecing together these different principles, but we're not just aimlessly doing it. These were extremely brilliant scientific academic people who were taking these very grounded scientific understandings that you're talking about and helping us better understand the emergence of skill, right? Appreciating constraints on behavior and acknowledging right here that the performer-environment relationship is the appropriate scale of analysis and how that's coming to life over and over and over again. And so I just think you have to double down on that, because every once in a while you will just run into that. And I don't think that we're just like a theory and we're not sure and we're hoping it's right. I think we're seeing over and over. I just wrote about this a couple days ago on a post with the gaze and visual perception book. Like, I get that people want to continue to have this conversation with different theories, but I think, and what we identified in part one, and how their additions changed, it seemed like they're like, I don't know, I just want to be done talking about information processing. It's so useless. I'm not learning anything from it. And the thing that I've experienced in the last couple of years entering into this world is that it seems like the information processing world, it's constantly trying to adjust or adapt to the new things the ecological dynamics is framing and explaining and better understanding. And I just don't see that from the ecological dynamic. I don't see the ecological dynamics side going, you know what? Information processing was right about this. We should make room in our theory for their little piece. It's like, no, they're having to make room for the environment. They're having to make, it's not that ecological dynamics isn't getting challenged, certainly cognition, things like that they'll get to. But I think it's, again, just an important point to hammer home is the strength of ecological dynamics just continues to be proven over and over. And that's why we're sitting here discussing it, because we think it's awesome. We think other people should start to adopt it as well.
Yeah. And to kind of go on something that you talked about last time that should be highlighted here that I think is a naturally jumping off point is that with the, like you were mentioning, like focusing on the mechanics and how if I improve this, then I'm going to improve their relationship or whatever to the environment. Oftentimes, when you start doing that, it's as what they're talking about here. The next component is like there's an asymmetry in terms of where the focus is. The focus is so heavily on the organism that it creates this imbalance where it's like, okay, we're going to focus on the organism and then we're going to try to bring back the environment later, or we're going to take the organism out of its natural environment, put it into this really stripped down, like nutrient deficient place and think that we're going to be able to like build something really strong and robust here. And then try to go back into this like rich environment and like see if you can handle it.
Isn't the classic like trying to take a lion in the zoo and reintroduce them into the jungle? It's like, good luck, man. Doesn't work. Yeah.
And so anyways, here's a spot like going back to like, this time they don't seem to spend as much time on, the information processing theory, but here in this section, they do talk about it, like talking about like, okay, you have this term organismic asymmetry, and it's really talking about how, okay, the environment is being neglected, and there's this bias towards a tendency towards seeking to explain human behavior through internalized reference schemas, programs, and plans. So like that there, they are referencing information processing theory, but really it's only maybe like a couple of paragraphs versus like there's multiple paragraphs and sections in their first edition. So to your point, like they don't really feel like they need to go into as much depth with these older ideas.
Well, interestingly, I've been watching a few videos from the Constraints Collective, and one of the cool things is to hear Keith Davids talk about kind of the history of all of the sort of interactions that these places have had. And he talked about, I think it was like a 1989 conference where they got both, at that point, the more ecological dynamic people that existed at that time and the more schema, information processing, representational people together. And they just tried to hash it out. And I think he said it was in Denmark. So people were super polite and it went really well. But he said that like at the end, they just got to a point where they said, we have to, because they were trying to get to a point where they talked back and forth. And by the end, the goal was like, can we figure out the best of both worlds and put these together? And they had to admit like, no, we can't. Like it was very cordial. But it was just like, and they ended up writing a book on like, just, hey, these two things, they just don't work together. And we're still discussing that, right? We're going to have a debate at the SMSC this year. That's kind of their main thrust this year. And we're still doing that in a lot of ways, which is super interesting to hear that, back in 89, they kind of did this and we're continuing to do that. But I do appreciate how I will say, I think that there's absolutely strength in the video I referenced earlier for you as a coach, if you're listening to this, to better understand not information processing, its ins and outs, but just like, oh, the things that I'm doing probably do at times align more with that. That was really beneficial for me, not as a thing to deep dive in, but just to go, oh, when we practice like the same way over and over and over again, that's what I'm doing. When I focus on mechanics at the expense of the environment they're embedded in, I'm not actually coaching within an ecological framework. That's actually really helpful. And it goes back to what you said. Oh, I can actually leave those things aside and not be worried about it. Like I can spend my time elsewhere.
I think for me on that point of like going back and watching Rob Gray's video on the information processing theory to motor learning versus the ecological approach, really where I see the biggest difference is in terms of how you're viewing it, because we're both looking at the same data, but it's more of where's our focus of attention. The two are focused on different things. And that's where you can start to like, it's not about looking at what are you doing necessarily. It is in part, but I can still, me personally, I feel like I could take something that an information processing person is doing, like a drill or whatever activity they're doing, and how I'm thinking about it and how I'm coaching the athlete in that. If I were forced to be in that environment, I would be doing it different, like how I'd be interacting, where I'd be trying to help the athlete explore. Actually, this ties with where we're hoping to land the plane, and we'll see if we get there, where we're trying to land the plane of like, the difference between generalized training versus more specific training and its transfer to the actual game. Because that's where I look at it, is like how I understand generalized training is how I'm going to be kind of thinking about this. Like there's ways to bridge it, but you have to understand I have also my expectations. Like that's like to see the difference between when I was thinking from a more information processing standpoint, my expectations for what should happen after the training environment that I create and run a guy through and the drills that I have him do is completely different than how I look at it, my expectations of the athlete after I do something that I know is more decontextualized. So again, like it's more to me, it's not so much about what are the activities necessarily, although I think you should always be asking the question as we get into, and maybe we should just transfer there to the transfer of training. Maybe we would do a whole separate episode on affordances. Or do you want to jump into because maybe we'll get into affordances when we start talking about like transfer of training.
I think we should at least acknowledge it just from the standpoint of, because the more that I went through this and like drew out the outline, because again, I was with you initially reading it going, man, there's a lot here. I don't understand the through line. I started to get it when it was like, oh, so you have that idea of co-adaptation. These things are interacting and affecting one another. There's this relationship, and it's the performer environment relationship. And what is undergirding that is this, help me find the best words here, but like it's this interaction of the information, the exchange of information between the performer and the environment. And that information is going to specify the affordances or the opportunities for actions. And that's ultimately why we want representative design and why we're thinking about transfer of training. So I appreciated that through line that they were trying to build. And so I think going from what we were just talking about, that performer environment relationship, the importance of the exchange of information starts to help us understand what are affordances and why do they, in a sense, sort of exist for us to connect to, and why do they exist? And they do a really good job, and I think in this section of going through all the little nooks and crannies of, what are affordances and how do they emerge and decay, and all the little things that you've probably read about. A lot of them are living and breathing right here.
Well, then let's just bounce back up a little bit, because as I'm looking at this, it does make sense of like you should talk about affordances before you get into transfer of training and essentially what comes before. Because if we're going through this in order, after the heading like learning design and ecological dynamics, then we talk about the performer environment relationship. Then the next component that it says key concept, but it seems as though it's kind of like, when you read a textbook and you have these little sidebars, right? Yeah. You'll always skip them. So like the formatting of this, it says key concept, the performer environment scale of analysis. That's like legitimately a key concept, but it looks as though it's a sidebar, like something that I just like kind of. Same, So anyways, I say all that to say is like, actually like this is the big idea here, is that when we do our analysis, the foundation and the fundamental thing that we need to apply here is we need to keep the performer environment in view and in picture. Like it needs to be the principle by which we are evaluating everything that is going on. That interaction, that relationship, we need to keep that in view. And so that's a key concept that everybody.
Let me give you an example of what I've just been thinking lately. Because one of our goals, we talked about this in the first one. We want to try to make this more accessible, right? But the second goal is kind of relating it to the baseball world. I've been trying to work ahead doing scouting. We were talking about this offline. And one of the things I do that's different now is I try to understand the environment that the athlete is embedded in. I don't just look at, because, now that I'm at the college sphere, guys are better in general, but also why did the behavior emerge the way it emerged? Were they behind in the count? What was the score? Where were the base runners? Was it the first at bat versus that pitcher, or was it the third at bat? Are they home, road? Was it cold? Was it warm? What time of the year? Was the wind blowing? Those are hard things to see on the scouting, but all these things challenge me to not just watch a bunch of pitches and go, oh, he can't hit a curveball. It's like embedded within what relationship? Where was the sequencing? And so sometimes it's easier because you'll see a guy just consistently struggle with certain pitches as you're watching video. But there are these different tabs that we can have, and I'm constantly clicking over to see what is the situation, what's the count. When I often look at a lot of swings to start and then explore around that if I need more information. And that's something with the performer environment relationship, because otherwise what I'm doing is I'm just looking at the performer and how they swing at curveballs all the time, and I'm not understanding what that's embedded in, and I'm not looking at the environment as well. And so that scale of analysis, I think, has helped me better understand how to scout guys more effectively, and not just look at, raw data and just say, well, it's all a monolithic thing and all fastballs are created equal against this guy. It's like, well, not necessarily.
Well, and two, I think to your point, like, yes, it comes back to like, there's always more to be gleaned there. Like you could say like, obviously, if you're looking at the curveball, well, that is part of the environment and the relationship that they have to that. But that's not the fullness of what is the environment. That is only just a small section of it. And I think part of when we go back to like the scale of analysis being the performer environment relationship, it is taking in the totality of that interaction and keeping that at the center of how we understand movement behavior. Not to get stuck on a point, I want to keep moving forward here. So as we go from there, like you talked about a few moments ago about, okay, the importance of information, and that information, I'm going to use a slightly different term here. I think you said, to me, I don't remember the word you used, but for me, the way that I would describe it is information reveals the affordances. It does. And to me, the reason I say reveals is like you could say reveal is another way to perceive, but like, okay, as I perceive that information, there will be moments in time where that affordance will just materialize for me. It'll reveal itself to me as like, okay, that's an affordance that I can accept. Or I'll begin to see, here's the other thing that I kind of don't like, but I understand, having talked with like Dr. Andrew Wilson, who we have had on the podcast, of, okay, we do want to talk about like more, like the system gets things right a lot. But it kind of frustrates me that it always talks about things in terms of like, oh yeah, affordances, like you only perceive affordances that you can actually act upon. I'm like, that is totally not true. I can perceive affordances that I cannot do yet. As I begin to become more sensitive to the information in the environment, I can begin to see more possibilities that may be beyond my action capabilities. But that also goes back to what the foundation of affordances are too, is that when they present themselves, the performer has the ability, or rather the performer then also perceives whether or not they want to interact with that affordance or to not interact with the affordance. They talk about it as the affordance appears, and it's an invitation that the performer is free to accept or reject. And so, like, for example, a ball is hit, and oftentimes you'll see players perceive like that ball doesn't afford me getting to, whether it's, like me standing up or me diving. And sometimes we like to try to tell our athletes, like, maybe you need to recalibrate that a little bit. Like, maybe you should just dive, and like every time you see a ball that's like that, like just the affordance there is to dive, and so like to accept that invitation more, or start to perceive and see that is an opportunity to act. And so this is where, but like to give it on like the most emergent version of what affordances are, because I think this is also a really key thing for people to understand. Affordances also just naturally emerge. So for example, a guy is running for a ball and he all of a sudden does something that everybody's just like, what the heck? Like, where did that come from? Well, that's where like that affordance just naturally emerged, and it was almost seamless between the athlete being in continuous contact with that information. And then as that moment unfolded and appeared, boom, the affordance was there and they immediately took it. And so to me, that's another example of affordances. And so it happens on all levels. To give one more example, I was at an FCA event, and we we're playing like this, like, it's kind of like football soccer. meaning you have goals at the end, and then instead of kicking the ball to move it down the field, if the ball, I can't remember how, but like you actually pick up the ball and so to move the ball down the field, you have to physically hold the ball and run. And once somebody touches you, then you can kick it, throw it, or whatever. And so I was chasing this person, and I recognized he's faster than I am. But I'm like, but if I take this angle, I can actually catch him. So instead of trying to chase after him, I picked a point out in front of him and I cut him off, and I was able to catch him. So that was a moment. That's another way to like see how affordances work and are mixed in with like cognition. It's not like these. This is one thing that I appreciated about Sean, and it kind of gets missed oftentimes when we start talking about like ecological dynamics is anti-representational. When you're like, well, what do you do with cognition? But like Sean talks about, like it's perception, cognition, action. I can't remember exactly, but there, he has like all these things are cognition is part of this process as well. And so, but cognition follows all the same principles, in my opinion. Your cognition has emergent behavior. There are affordances that appear within your cognition. So it's, to me, all these sort of principles are all present within cognition, and it fits, in my mind and in my opinion, all together seamlessly.
Yeah, and it's challenging because we're swimming in such incredible waters of how often do you sit and have to read an article or hear a podcast or hear somebody just speak about, well, when we did this test, it lit up this part of the brain, so that means exactly this. And it's like, well, is that a good, just because it lights up a part of your brain, is that a good, and some of the authors here themselves have said, that's a bad way to assess how movement behaviors are emerging. And so thinking of perceptions, cognitions, actions, not as separate or isolated processes, but instead as like these deeply intertwined and inextricably linked components of the human movement system. They are constantly interacting. One is affecting the other. The easiest example I always think is just how our intentions, our goals, our aspirations, our desires for what we're trying to accomplish. Like, oh, I'm going to try to throw this ball really hard by this guy. That will shape what I pay attention to, and that will shape my action. Like those are constantly interacting. It's not step 1, step 2, step 3. They're constantly interacting and intermingling back and forth. And so that's absolutely an important part that probably does get missed sometimes when we talk about affordances, because we're often talking about information and the perceptual system, and then how that perception action coupling. And it took me a while coming, because Rob Gray's tagline on every podcast is keep them coupled. He's also always talking about perception action. So when I first interacted and heard like, oh, perception cognition action, what's going on, that's different. But then I started reading these guys in this book. I go, oh, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. Mm-hmm. I just had to keep reading and find it.
Well, and here now it kind of brings up to this other component that I want to kind of touch on that makes ecological dynamics uniquely different than the information processing approach. But to kind of give a definition from the book on affordances. In sport, affordances capture relations between an athlete and a performance environment that may be directly perceived, inviting adaptive actions from individuals under different performance conditions. What I want to highlight here, because mostly said in general things that we've already discussed, but what I want to highlight here is that affordances can be directly perceived by the athlete. There's no need for mediation. These things are essentially it's like these things appear. It's not like when I realized that, it was not like I was processing I was like, okay, I can't catch this guy. There's the realization. There was maybe, okay, some processing you could say, quote unquote, of I can't catch this guy. There's this realization I can't catch him. And then I was asking the question of well, how can I do this? I didn't calculate this. I simply asked the question. And then it was directly, as I'm interacting in the environment, I see, I can directly perceive well, if I get this angle, I can go cut him off. And so to me, this is where direct perception is something that is different. It's not like, oh, I had to calculate my speed or whatever. No, I
Yeah.
was using tau. Tau was telling me that I did not have this, like, he was growing bigger in my retinal vision. I could directly perceive that he was going faster than I was. So there's a question of like, okay, how else can I catch him? Do I just give up and just be like, he's got me? And so like this is to me where, again, like you can start to see how like our cognitions and our perceptions all work, and like they work in this like direct, almost unmediated way to be able to interact with the environment. And so like that's what I'd say is like also another thing that makes these ideas different than information processing, because there wasn't like, a full schema or whatever. Anyways, that's where I think that's the other element to kind of highlight here, and that the affordances are specific to the situation and they emerge in decay. So like the affordance to cut him off only lasts for so long. Do you know what I mean? So if like, let's use football as an example, like the gap to get between a gap, like that gap's only open for so long. Maybe to analogize it for like hitting, right? Like your window to hit the baseball and to do it, to be able to contact it well and to do something with it, there's only a certain window for you to be able to do that. Stealing a base, I think, is actually another really good one. Like when to go or advancing in base running, like those affordances emerge and decay very quickly. So like being highly attuned and sensitive to those things to be able to act upon them is kind of more what we're kind of talking about here.
Yeah, those are really good examples. The thing I've appreciated about affordances is how it's really empowered the athlete for me, as opposed, because I think direct perception it's still hard for me to sometimes just understand in the everyday stuff of coaching. But the place that it makes the most sense is that I don't have to give my players the answers. They don't lack knowledge in their brain. I don't have to tell them. Now, I might need to guide their attention to something that they weren't noticing if they're struggling, but I'm not going to go there right away. I'm going to let them kind of experience the problem. I might try to shift and change the design of the environment to see if the behavior emerges. But sometimes I do have to direct their attention. There's no doubt about that. Like I've been working with my daughter trying to apply some of these principles in basketball, and it's been kind of fun to see how just setting her up on problems, some behaviors will emerge that we've never really worked on, but they'll emerge because it's the right time for that behavior to happen, because it fits with the task that she's trying to accomplish. It fits with the goal of the activity. And that's been cool to see, because it reminds me it's not living in her brain. She doesn't know how to do that. Nobody's taught her. Nobody's told her. And so that's really empowered the athletes. And so therefore, that idea of affordances then has led me to more effectively think, okay, within my practice activities, then can I push and stretch and challenge them to become more representative, as representative learning design? Can I make sure that the information that they're connecting to, knowing that that's what's going to drive those opportunities for action that they're going to either accept or reject, can I put them in environments that are representative of what they're actually going to do, so that they can start to a better attune to those affordances?
Let's see. Don't want to go into that right now. I think let's keep moving, because I'll loop into it if we get to specificity and general transfer or general training. Let's see. One thing that I kind of want to touch on here, and let's see if I can pull this in. So another thing on affordances that I think might be interesting is to kind of talk about like this idea and this concept of like action readiness. So hopefully this is a good segue into it. In this way, affordances can be viewed as resources available in a performance environment that can constrain or make behaviors possible. They do not cause behaviors. I think that's really important to note. The soliciting effect of affordances draws the performer towards certain behaviors. This effect can be seen in individuals who may be immediately drawn toward certain actions, indeed being in a state of action readiness in certain fields within the affordance landscape. Oh, okay, this is where actually earlier in the chapter it talks about metastability. I actually think and Rob Graves has talked about this, metastability, its real benefit, I think, is about action readiness. It's the ability to, you put yourself in a situation where you're able to be adaptable, and you're putting your system in a state to be able to shift and actually to stay connected to the environment, to be most adaptable. That's where I want to at least touch on this idea, because I do think like when we're trying to help our athletes, it's not, again, going to your point of like, we're not trying to solve it for them, but to put them in a state where they're able to connect with the information and their system is primed to be sensitive or attuned to that information, and their system is ready to respond to that.
Yeah, that's good.
I do want to just reiterate, though, since we said, like I said it, I really want to highlight this. Affordances do not cause behaviors. I think that needs to be just kind of reiterated there. All right. Do we want to touch on affordance landscapes? Because, I mean, this is really, like, honestly, or do we want to kind of land the plane here, you know, before we get to this? Because, I mean, this is like maybe we do a whole episode on learning design, because this at this point, like, really opens up to me, like, this is how, once we start talking about landscapes, it really influences how I think about learning design and how I'm thinking about my practice design and what is happening there.
Yeah, the more you say that, I mean, they're going to get into what I just referred to in terms of representative learning design right after this, but that this is the gateway to that. And so I think you're right. I think, you know, taking another session to talk about affordance landscapes, learning design, and then they'll get to representative learning design and then transfer, which is, again, what we're ultimately after. And I think it makes sense, all the work that even we've done in these first two episodes, it makes sense why they do all this work, is because they really do want to send this framework, this base, this ground level, like, hey, transfer is what we're after. Like, we're all, as coaches, we want to transfer skills from practice to the game more effectively. And so it makes sense that even though, yeah, it feels very thick, that's the important part of all of this theoretical foundation, is when we do better understand it, we can better design environments. We can do learning design more effectively in our sport. So yeah, I agree. I think that's probably a good thing to leave for another episode, because there's still a lot of meat on the bone to finish this chapter.
Yeah. And to your point there of like, this is setting things up, I think like all these concepts that we've kind of gone over today, what we started with adaptability or adaptation. Mm-hmm. Then we went into the performer environment relationship, and that is the scale of analysis that like we don't want to, going back to the Eco D10 commandments. Like, this is like the first one is like, thou shalt not forget, it basically shall not analyze an athlete without respecting the performer environment or keeping the performer environment relationship front and center and central to what you're doing. So there's that. And then we kind of went into, I believe, did we do a detour there? Was there a detour?
A couple small detours, yeah.
Then we went into affordances, and to kind of wrap on what you're saying, like, to me, all these ideas and concepts are the ingredients that go into understanding what you want to have within your practice design. And then going back to this again, like, the thing that I kind of had issues with the adaptation piece, like this continuously co-adaptation and like reorganization of system degrees of freedom. Essentially with this, right, if you understand these different concepts that we laid out here, you can reorganize them in whatever way to fit your athletes, your program and whatnot. And so to me, that's what I kind of want to leave people with is, okay, now that we've kind of laid out all these kind of ingredients as we get into this, now you start to begin to understand, okay, these are the components that I need to keep in mind as I start to design my practice.
Yeah, I'm even just trying to look ahead to see if they'll hit adaptability in a different way, kind of in the table of contents. Nothing jumps out hugely, but if they'll talk about it a little bit more in the way that we've been talking about it here, I don't see anything big in the table of contents, but yeah, I think that's when you and I first met, this man, what is the elevator pitch, or what is the 30-second? That's the challenge with ecological dynamics. But it's also the beauty of it, is that it's so rich and deep that you can start from a lot of different places. And I think that speaks to the theoretical framework's own adaptability, that it can kind of enter into so many different places. It's not just, oh, we have one thing to say about this part of the game, or this thing that we do, or this certain drill activity. A lot of frameworks are built around, well, this will help you when you separate it over here. I think that's the beauty of ecological dynamics, is that it can live and breathe in just about every different space, and it can help give you a better understanding of why skill is emerging the way it is.
Absolutely. And to that point of like, it fits in all these different situations, is like, that's what it's basically like, its core tenet is
Yes.
about adaptability and being able to find a functional fit in any given situation. Yeah. Hope you guys enjoyed today's podcast. Until next time, we're looking forward to doing part 3.